Guys, thanks everyone. I was making a quick introduction, and thank you to Charlie Bachtell, of course, CEO of Cresco Labs, for joining us rescheduling. The first thing I want to say, Charlie, I mean, of course, big congratulations on the DEA news. I know the industry and you yourself in particular have put in a lot of effort over the years on this. So let's start first, please, for those that are not so familiar with the subject, please articulate the benefits of rescheduling cannabis from Schedule 1 to 3.
So there are, and congratulations to all the stakeholders in the space. This is a really big, momentous occasion. This is sort of the first domino to fall in respect to federal reform. So for those that aren't as familiar with the implications of being a Schedule 1, first and foremost, by definition, you're deemed to have no medicinal value. And I think there's an acknowledgement, we all get wrapped up in sort of the potential change in whether it's economic or otherwise, that comes from a rescheduling event. But I think first and foremost, the acknowledgement by HHS and FDA, and at this point, the DEA, that the evidence supports the medicinal value of cannabis is big. And I don't think we should miss that in this, in the development here. But the implications of being a Schedule 1, most know, significant restrictions on access to resources that most traditional businesses would have, whether that's access to capital, cost of capital, and definitely the tax implications of it. From a research standpoint, and really research and data is the way that any industry goes through the types of changes in the normalization and professionalization that we're looking for. It's database, right? The evidence needs to be there, data needs to be there. That has been one of the largest roadblocks for progress at a federal reform level historically, is the lack of federally sponsored clinical research to help support a broadening view or a more progressive view on the regulations and legislation related to cannabis. So if I was going to summarize it, the impact of this being the first domino to fall is giant. I think the ability to do more research and have that data to support a more progressive view on how to regulate cannabis appropriately is giant. I can't understate the impact on legislative opinion that this is also going to have. Over the last few years, many times, I've had conversations with senators and congressmen and women where they're apprehensive to do anything at a legislative front for a Schedule 1 substance. And so the fact that after this process concludes, this should be rescheduled to a Schedule 3 is very important from that legislative opinion standpoint. And of course, the tax implications no longer being underneath the IRC 280 is huge. Only speaking on behalf of Cresco Labs, and we've publicly reported this before. You know, for us, that's approximately about a $70 million impact that truly goes to the bottom line if we're no longer subject to IRC Section 280E.
Thank you, Charlie. Look, let's there's a lot to cover there, but let's discuss first the next steps in the process, okay? There are, and I'm going to read through this here and you walk us through it, of course. The DEA, the DOJ sent the proposed draft rule to the OMB. Why is this needed? Will the draft become public as soon as this week? Then the OMB has to review, we understand could take as long as 90 days. Then there's a public comment period. I believe this is already confirmed, right? As long as 60 days, hearings to follow. And then the DOJ has to write the final ruling to be placed in the Federal Register, and how long would that take? And we understand that once this is placed in the Federal Register, it has to be there for another, 30 days before it becomes effective. So again, we want to discuss the benefits, and there are significant benefits. Even, with stocks being up right now, we already have benefits. But I want to, for people listening here, walk us through the process the way you understand it, Charlie.
Sure, and I do have to caveat it with, I would defer to a scholar, a specific scholar as it relates to policy here and procedure. But I will share my understanding. And my understanding, it starts with, unfortunately, there's not a prescribed obligation when it comes to these timeframes. There's general understandings based on precedent. but exactly how long a public comment period needs to be, or the period of time that a potential hearing period could take are not set in law. So there's fluidity in as long as these processes may take. I do think we can expect this to go through a fairly traditional review process. I think that was part of making sure that this is substantiated and is as supportive as possible coming on the outside, on the other end of a formal rescheduling, is that this has gone through a fairly traditional regular order process. So like you said, OMB, the significance of that, I haven't heard concern or expectations that there would be concern in the OMB process. That could be a fairly expeditious process just because of the subject.
Charlie, I'm gonna have to stop you there. I mean, there is an issue with the space here. We're getting feedback that people are getting cut off. We're gonna have to reset it all over again, if you don't mind. Okay, I'm gonna stop and reset, and we'll start again. My apologies. It's a tech issue here.
No worries.
We're going to reset. Bye. All right, Charlie, here we go again. Can you hear me? Yes?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Right. Okay. Yeah, let's go through it. So just pick up where we left off. You were going through the process, right? And all we're trying to do here, I mean, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from my perspective, this process has taken longer than expected, in part because the White House is being very systematic about the whole process, trying to dot all the I's, cross all the T's, and make sure this is bulletproof. I mean, that's my opinion, right? Of course, take it with a grain of salt. And we're going to have to go through a very, step-by-step process here. And that will include the OMB and the public comment period and hearings, and then, time to write the final ruling and put it on the Federal Register. But personally, I take this as a good thing, although there's a question mark in terms of how long this drags on, right? So on that subject, go back to what you're saying. And again, apologies to everybody on the line. Yeah,
no worries. And I think your perspective on this is very fair, and I share it. Again, we'll know more about the process that will unfold as more formal releases come from the parties involved. So we'll know more about this in the days to come as it comes out of OMB. But I agree with your assessment, and this is based on conversations that I've had with former senior members of both the DOJ and HHS. They support exactly what you said, that they are dotting the I's, they're crossing the T's. While this is still moving expeditiously from an objective standpoint, I think everybody, of course, is hoping that it would have moved through the DEA review process and an announcement would have been made earlier. But dotting I's and crossing the T's does set this up to be more secure and finalized coming out of this process. And should they have tried to expedite or force the issue further, that would have exposed the process itself to much greater delays and significant risk than dotting the I's and crossing the T's. So I know it's a tough ask, but I think that is the right path is being taken here to make sure that we get the best outcome.
Understood. And then just to be clear in terms of the next steps, the way you understand them. So the draft rule, becomes public and before it gets sent to the OMB, or it's not public yet. Any thoughts on that? And how long does the OMB process take according to you?
Yeah, my understanding is it'll become the notice of public rulemaking is subsequent to the OMB review.
Subsequent. Okay, so not before. So we won't have the details of that draft rule until the OMB is done then.
Yeah, that's my understanding. And again, from a timing standpoint, also, from what I'm hearing, we don't expect a significant review process from OMB, but it's all subject to them doing it the right way and taking their appropriate amount of time. But we don't expect that to be a significant review period.
Okay, understood. And here I'm not going to push too much on the legal scholar type of questions here, but any quick thoughts in terms of whether I need to say it won't take very long. Some people are saying it would take as long as 90 days. Any thoughts on that? And any thoughts in terms of the timing of the public comment period in terms of days?
No, again, I would defer. We'll get more clarity as it comes out. My understanding is with all of these review periods, none of them are required or mandated by law and on as short or as long as they could take. So I think we're all subject to finding out the period of review, period of comment. As those get announced, we'll have more clarity.
Right. Okay. And the last question on that subject, on the legality of things. So once the OMB is done, the draft rule has to become public before the public comment period, obviously, right?
That's my understanding.
Okay. All right. Now, I'm going to come back to the subject, but let's just move on for a second here. There are concerns also about, once this process is completed, once we get to the point that we have the final ruling on the Federal Register, that there could be a judicial review and challenges, and the process could drag on there. Any quick thoughts on that, Charlie?
It is possible, and I know that there's a lot of discussion around the timing of this, as of course, as it relates to this being an election year. And again, without pontificating on the what ifs in that scenario, I firmly, my perspective and based on experience and based on the data that's come out as it relates to cannabis, the risk of there being a change, whether it's from a new administration or otherwise, I think we all need to remind ourselves how popular of an issue this is. When you're talking about medical cannabis, which is all we're talking about here, right, is where cannabis falls on the CSA as a schedule. This is a medical related decision. Medical cannabis polls at 90+%. There's very few things out there. There's very few issues out there that have such a popular polling number as medical cannabis does. So I think whether the risk of there being a change or a reversal, whether that's based on a new administration or otherwise, I think we have to remind ourselves at how popular of an issue this is. From a political perspective, you'd have to ask what would be the benefit of there being a change, and especially when you're talking about something at the core and where regulated cannabis does exist is a states' rights issue. These are state laws, these are state programs, and there's another very prolific issue that's currently being discussed that also has the support of a states' rights approach to it from what could be the other administration. So when it comes to the risk associated with the decision here being overturned or challenged or reversed, I go back to the data. I go back to the polling numbers and the popularity of this issue, and I try to figure out why, from a political standpoint, they would see value in a reversal, and I just don't see it.
Right, and there we're really talking about two things, right? Whether there's a judicial review period or not, and how long that takes, and whether the judge puts a stay on the whole process or not. But there's also, of course, the result of the election, right? And sure, in your opinion, and I think I read some comments you made on the subject, even if Trump were to win the White House, you think that because of high polling, this may not be reversed. And I know, we're speculating here, but any comments on that?
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. This is speculation, but again, I go back to the data, I go back to the popularity of the issue, and I ask myself why. And I think it would be an interesting path to go down. I think, again, HHS has a binding authority on the scientific evaluation of this. From a political perspective, again, subjective, it's speculation, but I don't see this as having the political benefit of trying to put the toothpaste back in that tube.
Right. Look, and before we move on the discussion here, obviously the industry has done a great job in terms of lobbying the many, levels out there, whether it's, Congress at the federal level, state level, the executive branch. But, I suppose that your lobbying efforts also are in touch with the Trump team in some way, right? I mean, can you talk about that in general terms?
No, I think, look, the lobbying efforts Cresco leads, and again, as an organization, and it also is chairman of the National Cannabis Roundtable, NCR, and the USCC, it's an education and awareness campaign. That's what we're doing from a lobbying front. So it is telling the cannabis story. Cannabis has a phenomenal story to tell, both from the medicinal side of it, from the economic opportunity, from the social responsibility component. There's just a phenomenal story to be told. And as stewards of the industry, that's what we do. So that's party agnostic. The more that legislators and politicians know and understand about the industry and the state structures and the checks and balances that are in place and inherent in the regulated industry, it creates a more educated and understanding and thoughtful approach to legislation at a federal level, and that's what we do.
Right. And look, I mean, just last question on the process, and I know that we're somewhat speculating here, but in your opinion, do you think we get this whole thing completed and implemented before the election?
I do, and again, that's just based on conversations and evaluations, historic and precedent as it relates to timeframes, and not forgetting the fact that this process was requested by the sitting president of the United States. That's a fairly unique data point when it comes to a rescheduling process and decision, was that this was an important enough issue to where the executive branch requested for it to happen. So I think in totality, you take all of those together, and I feel positive about this being a 2024 issue.
Great. So again, going back to the proposed ruling, we don't know what it looks like yet, right? But to your knowledge, will there be any changes to the ways that medical cannabis is prescribed, distributed, and sold? Any changes in FDA supervision? Although placed in Schedule 3, medical cannabis will remain federally illegal. How does this impact recreational cannabis, if at all? Any thoughts on that in terms of what we know or what you know?
So I would say from an administrative standpoint of what regulations and governing bodies come into play, I think that is after the decision will be made, after the final ruling is issued. We'll get a lot more line of sight into that. If the hemp example could set any sort of line of sight into the way that this could go, it's going to be tough to speculate. And you match that up with the fact that you do have established state structures in place, both for medical and for adult use approach to cannabis. So it'll be interesting. I think it's unlikely that there would be significant change at a federal oversight level immediately following the rescheduling. It just seems incredibly unlikely. But it's all speculation, and we'll see on it. But incredibly unlikely that there would be a significant change in approach.
Right. And on that point, Charlie, I know that we've over the years, I guess months, we've always debated this subject of bifurcation. Obviously, in Schedule 1, cannabis is not bifurcated. You mentioned about, medical cannabis falling over 90%. There you were bifurcating yourself. But the way that the rescheduling, the way it's being done, the way you understand it, there's no bifurcation as such.
From a scheduling standpoint, agreed, because the substance is what gets scheduled. It's not the intended use of the substance or the mindset of the consumer that matters. It's the substance itself is what gets evaluated and what gets scheduled. So there would, I don't think there's any precedent for a bifurcated approach to the intended use of the substance and that impacting its scheduling.
Right. And obviously, there's no change from a federal standpoint. There would be no change in terms of imports, exports, or even interstate trade.
I would not expect there to be. But again, it's going to be a process, I would say, for years ahead in sort of the implications of a Schedule 3. Also, look, from a political standpoint, this is not the end of the federal reform discussion. And Schedule 3, I think, should be truly looked at as the first domino in the broader federal reform effort to fall. And whether or not cannabis should be scheduled at all is a conversation that'll continue. There's pending legislation, previously introduced legislation that clearly and on its face would remove cannabis from the scheduling in total. So I think the discussion about this is nothing changes in sort of that aspect. It's just we now actually have the first move at a federal level related to federal reform of cannabis that once this process is concluded, that will be complete, which is fantastic.
Okay, and on the same subject, right, there's been speculation about that this rescheduling would come together with some type of accompanying framework, call it a Garland memo or a call memo 2, that would be issued. Any thoughts on that? If so, when and when does it become public?
Whether or not there will be one will be determined by the Department of Justice and the AG. I think it would be, I think there's a likelihood that we will get one. I think it would make sense to get some clarity, because again, even though cannabis is moving from would be moving from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3, which changes its treatment sort of at a federal level for various reasons, you still have these state programs that exist. So some additional clarity, some perspective or opinion on how the federal government plans to, and the DOJ in particular, plans to handle the cannabis topic, I think it would be appreciated by stakeholders involved, but that's a decision that the AG and the DOJ will make.
Understood. Look, before we go on, and I'm going to ask you to repeat a couple of things here for the audience, just for clarity's sake. So in terms of new information, in terms of what's being proposed, or in terms of potential rules or rules changes, or even a framework, when do people start to get that? At what part in the process, in your opinion? And I'm sorry I'm making a repeat here, but I just want to clarify in terms of when do people get this type of new information?
All good. I think our next sort of expectation would be when that notice of public rulemaking is issued. And my understanding is that happens after the OMB process. There should be more clarity on next steps and process that accompanies it.
Right, but even then, those type of details that we were talking about, you know, whether the way medical cannabis is prescribed or not, those type of things will come later, or at that stage, in your opinion?
Oh, certainly. I think that comes after there's the conclusion, the final rule on the scheduling of it.
Right, and take a stab also the question of the call memo too. When does it come through? And again, I know we're speculating here, but if it comes, when will it come, in your opinion?
I would expect that would come after final rule is issued, if it comes.
Right. Okay, understood. All right. Look, moving on to discussion here. What may change even before the ruling becomes effective? You know, and I think that maybe people sometimes don't pay enough attention to this, but I'll throw some examples, right? Share prices are up. That's already good for companies in terms of M&A currency, raising capital. You know, anecdotally, I think we all see more investors participating in the space. You know, strategics will become more active. I mean, could U.S. exchanges become more welcoming even before the ruling becomes effective? Could banks increase services to the industry? You know, that's all this spur legislation, legislators in Ohio, Pennsylvania to act, you know, sooner. Does it spur Congress to pass other related legislation? Does it embolden companies regarding 280E? I know there's a lot of stuff there, but what I'm trying to say from your perspective, even though we don't have the final ruling, and this process could go on for a few more months, right? There's a lot of benefits and things happening right now, right? You want to walk through some of those?
Yeah, look, at the risk of being too general, I think the ripple effects of this are giant, and I think they go in all of those directions. I think it's cannabis, unfortunately, because of the perceived delay in reform at a federal level, has been suffering for a couple of years now of a disinterest from, or concern from, the investor community, from, again, even legislators. As I mentioned earlier, the legislative opinion impact, I think, is something that might be the most beneficial impact of a rescheduling, is those legislators at a state level and at a federal level that have previously said, look, it's a Schedule 1 substance. I really can't wrap my head around designing legislation that makes it okay in whatever capacity is being discussed to make it okay to deal with operators in a Schedule 1 substance. So the changes that come from that perspective change, that opinion change, that ability to now dig in, wrap their arms around it, put in the mind share to help developing solutions that would help the industry look and feel and operate more traditionally. The implications of that and the impacts of that are immense and probably immeasurable in how great they could be. So, but do I expect any of that to officially happen before final ruling on this. I think it's getting the attention. You can see from the media coverage, news coverage on this issue over the last, I don't know, what's it been, 18 hours. It's fantastic for the subject matter to get this level of attention and interest brought back to it. We'll see on a case-by-case basis what happens, who makes official actual moves prior to rule change. We'll see. But it's nice to have the interest brought back to this and the focus brought back to cannabis.
Right. Look, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but in terms of, when we're talking about Congress, in terms of how it may spur Congress to act, do you think it has any immediate implications on SAFER?
Look, I think every new data point, this is one thing I've learned over the years in DC, every new data point has a potential implication on subjects and topics and potential bills that are being discussed. Everything does. Look, we've been on the other end of it, right? Where this is a good guy that could positively impact the approach of it, or the approach to legislating cannabis. We've seen the other side of it too, where other matters that have nothing to do with cannabis whatsoever negatively impact the development of cannabis moving forward in legislation, because it takes attention away from it and focus to other more pressing issues in the minds of the legislators. So yeah, every positive move when it comes to cannabis has the ability to create more positive moves as it relates to cannabis.
Understood. And then that's on the congressional side. What about the U.S. exchanges? I mean, could they become more welcoming to plant-touching companies listing before the rule becomes effective, or that's unlikely? What's your opinion on that?
I would still say it's unlikely, but again, every data point, every move in this direction is another data point for them to weigh comfort level. So I think the perfect scenario is an explicit clarification that cannabis can be listed, or that there would be a safe harbor extended to the exchanges. Anything less than that is just a data point that'll be considered as they're evaluating their comfort level. So of course, a rescheduling would be helpful. A clarification or guidance from the DOJ and the AG would be helpful. So anything along those lines would make it more likely that they could get comfort, but that's the decision that they'll need to make.
Right. Look, on the same subject, in terms of 280E, and I'm talking like right now, right? We don't have a final ruling, but does this embolden companies to become more aggressive in the way they think about and plan around 280E? I mean, what's your opinion and what's Cresco's position on that?
Every company needs to do their own evaluation and come up with their own level of comfort. But again, I think even going back to when the HHS made their announcement and their determination, that is a significant decision by HHS to find medicinal value in cannabis, which again, by definition, means that it can't be a Schedule I, right? And so as companies are evaluating the applicability of 280E to the back situation, to their operations and the subject matter that they deal with, that's a pretty significant determination. So I think, again, everything along the lines of rescheduling is helpful in that 280E impact evaluation at a company level. And that's why I think everybody's as excited. It's one of the reasons why everybody's as excited about this rescheduling as they are. The impacts of getting out from underneath 280E are giant for small, medium, large operators in the space. For sure.
And then just if you can try to quantify the cash flow benefits for Cresco in the case of 280E being removed, and also, what would you do with those proceeds?
Yeah, we've talked about it on our calls. I think over the last couple of years with the revenue levels, you're looking at something around $70 million on an annual basis that we've been paying in taxes that a traditional business in a traditional industry that can take traditional business deductions would not have had to pay. So, it's $70-ish million on an annual basis. And not only is it the actual dollar figure, but if you think about cost of capital being as high as it is for operators in our space, whether it's on the debt side or on the equity side, that's a no cost of capital. And so the impact of that is even bigger than just the dollar figure. And as all of us are looking at the footprints that we have, the operations that we have, as we need to make investments, as we look at As we look at debt obligations that we have coming in the years ahead, that's a significant amount of additional cash that operators will have access to. So I think the applicability of it and the impact of it is immense.
And look, on the same subject, and I know there's only so much you can say, but obviously your share price is up. You have a stronger currency in those terms. How do you make use of that in the short term, if in any way? What can you share with us in that regard?
Yeah, I think again, this is a valuation that every organization needs to make of what their short-term capital needs are, and also what their near to medium-term obligations are. And so finding the best use of that dollar with the highest return on investment or the highest return on application is just something that every company is going to be doing. Again, not to put the cart in front of the horse. The final rule needs to happen here in order for that actual impact to occur. But I do think even the steps that have the data points and the actual actions that we've seen so far from an HHS determination are impactful as it relates to the 280E question. I think that does strengthen an argument that 280E may not be applicable to your organization if you're in the cannabis space.
Right. Look, and just maybe going back to the process for 1 second, but obviously the industry has been lobbying for many years, and the lobbying doesn't stop, right? But over the next 6 months, where are the areas where you can really lobby or educate, as you say? Because there are parts, I suppose, that, the OMB, I don't know if you can be lobbying the OMB, right? But where are the parts that you can influence in this process, in your opinion?
So again, as it relates to this process, it's limited, but it is the continuation of the education and making sure that the data is out there and in publicly available ways. And to your point, like the lobbying doesn't stop. There's, the Kobe Bryant quote of job not done, job not done here. We definitely need to continue to push for greater reform. This is one of the largest consumer products categories in the future for the United States, and we need to have that normalized, professionalized industry, and we need to have the legislative and regulatory framework that's supportive of it too.
Great. Look, just moving on in terms of, we've talked about the practical changes, right, for the industry, and you talked about research, obviously, to ADE and a number of other benefits. But if you were a political strategist for the White House, how do you promote rescheduling, in terms of the public benefit that would, push voters to support Biden in terms of just the political? What would you say from that standpoint if you were a political strategist?
Look, I think the executive branch definitely deserves credit for they initiated this process. So like you could stop there and say rescheduling was requested by this administration to occur, and it is the first. Not only the most significant, it will be the first sort of example of federal reform since Nixon launched the war on drugs 50 plus years ago. There's been a lot of administrations over that period of time that acknowledged the sort of the inappropriate approach to cannabis that federal law had, but nothing has happened at a federal level over the last 50 plus years. So, from that perspective, I think the administration deserves to get some credit for requesting that this process be launched, understanding that the data was now available that could support the reevaluation and a different determination being made by HHS and DEA.
Understood. Look, and then just moving on in terms of the subject, the argument, the way that we understand this is going to play out, we will still have this conflict between the federal and state law, right? That's the assumption you're making, the assumption that I'm making, I think most people are making.
Correct.
But I guess I will ask the question the other way, why fear federal legalization of medical cannabis? I mean, in my opinion, if it were federally legal, this would open the door, to full-blown banking services. It would also lift up listing, bring in more investors. It will open up international, facilitate partnerships with corporations outside cannabis. I mean, it would seem to me that federal legalization of medical cannabis would be a good thing for the industry, or do you disagree with that?
Oh, yeah, I think progress for cannabis is positive. The how is important. It always is. But I think, why fear it? I think, again, if I could, unfortunately, I've been exposed to enough legislators on both sides of the aisle too. This is not unique to the right side of the aisle. It understandably can be tough when you have thousands of subject matters and issues that you need to that come across your desk and that you need to be a part of and weigh in on, to be able to wrap your head around legislation related to a Schedule I substance that's been legal at the state level but is still considered a Schedule I at a federal level. It gives you a pretty easy opportunity to say, I'm not going to engage any further until something happens there, because it's really hard for me to support just devoting that time and attention. Again, I don't agree with this. Please understand. But I take that as my burden, is that I need to, that's part of the education efforts that we focus on in DC and at state levels, is to get them to understand why they should pay attention and why they should engage and why they should devote not only their time, but their political capital into addressing the cannabis issue, even though it has been a Schedule I, continues to be, but hopefully changes in the future. That, taking that away, making this a Schedule III, will allow a more open approach to thinking about greater federal reform going forward. I think the most obvious benefit is the long-term ripple effects on what this is going to have for cannabis reform at a federal level.
No, thank you. Of course, that's great. Look, Charlie, I'll be very mindful of your time here, but if I may, I want to use this time also to ask your views, the latest on Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida. Just quick thoughts on where we are with the process there. We keep hearing back and forth in terms of Ohio and Pennsylvania. Florida, I guess we're just waiting for the ballot, but just quick thoughts there, please. Thanks.
Look, I think Ohio overall seems to be positive from a timeline standpoint. It's nice to see the administration in place there recognize the complexity that can come from too much time between a law passing in a regulated marketplace being launched. So it's encouraging to see the overall push there to expedite the launch of that program compared to hold it back or restrict it, as we've seen in some other states. Pennsylvania, like the process there is ongoing, and passing legislation is always challenging, and it comes with twists and turns related to your issue and other issues. So the work is still being done there to get appropriate legislation passed in 2024. And on the Florida side, congratulations to the progress that's been made to be on the ballot this coming November, but a lot of work is still left ahead to make sure that 60+ percentage votes are cast in favor of the issue. There's a lot of work to be done there. We're not relaxing at all. That's a big thing for the industry, is getting both of those two states to get appropriate adult use legislation passed in 2024.
Right. And any quick thoughts on New York? How Cresco is thinking on New York?
Cresco, the way that we're thinking about New York is it's a very challenging marketplace to make a decision to deploy resources into. There's other opportunities in our network. The regulatory structure there, I think it just continues to present itself with a very challenging marketplace. And there's frustrations throughout that administration in the way that program has unfolded. So I think with that brings a likelihood of changes or modifications being made, which need to be evaluated as they come out. So it's unfortunate that the New York program is launched the way that it did. My silver lining there is I think other states and the federal government will learn from the New York example. It's a great data point.
Okay, thank you. Look, just going back to federal, and before you make closing remarks, I guess what would you say to investors here? I mean, this is a sector, right, with obviously enormous growth potential, significant catalysts in the months and years ahead. But in my opinion, there's a lot of fast money, right? In and out. Stocks were up significantly yesterday. They are down today, right? When you see that, I don't know what's your reaction, but again, what would be your message to investors here, where we are?
I think investors should be encouraged by this development and again, how the market reacts to it. And it's going to do what the market is going to do on it. I have limited ability to control it, but I think just from an overall objective viewpoint, investors should be really encouraged. The first domino, right? That's what we're talking about here is a rescheduling of cannabis to bring it out of Schedule 1. And again, if you take a step back, if you go to 10,000 feet and what that means for this industry over a longer period of time, it's dramatic. And it's great to be a part of this. And I think we will look at this as, fast forward 10, 20, 50 years from now as a watershed moment when this opportunity of U.S. cannabis became the opportunity that we all know it is. It started here. So it's very encouraging. It's exciting and glad to be a part of it.
That's great. Thank you. Look, before we finish, just for everyone listening, I appreciate you joining. Apologies for the technical difficulties at the beginning. In these calls, I ask the questions. I take questions from email, from the bubble also. I also remind everyone that tomorrow we are hosting a call with Shane Pennington to discuss, the legal process of rescheduling. So very much appreciate that. The other comment I wanted to make here on my behalf, and Charlie, apologies here for holding on. The way that we like to think about as analysts, we don't seek to set the narrative, right? And I don't mean that obviously very good friends with the Dutch report there. We do not seek to set the narrative. Okay, what I seek to do is to look at scenarios, think how things would play out, and help investors think through it, right? That's what I've done for 20 years as a sell-side analyst, and the people on the buy side are the ones that pull the trigger and make their decisions. We try to be constructive and helpful to the industry, but also, look at scenarios and see how things will play out. And that's what we will do over the next few months on what's in a very interesting process. But obviously, it's historic, right, in terms of where we are and in terms of what could come next. So, Charlie, I very much appreciate you taking the time here to talk to us. Any closing remarks you want to do? And again, thank you.
No, I appreciate the opportunity and the platform. Excited to see this unfold and excited for the industry. Thanks for having me, Pablo.
Thank you, Charlie, and thanks everyone for listening in. Thank you.